It was an unarmed prophet against the greatest army in the region. An elderly man living in a small city without walls, surrounded by cavalry, archers, and war chariots that had marched through the entire night just to capture him. The math was simple: thousands against one. When the sun began to rise over the hills of Dothan, the siege was already complete. No way out, no escape route, no human hope. But that morning, around 850 years before Christ, the numbers did not tell the whole story, because there was something on the mountain, something the king of Syria could not see. And when the right eyes were opened, it became clear that that prophet had never been alone. To understand how a single man became the target of an entire army, we need to go back a few months, to the moment when a war began to be won, without a single sword being raised. The conflict between Israel and Syria was nothing new. For decades, the two kingdoms had lived in constant tension. This was not a declared war with formal battles and open fields. It was a conflict of ambushes, fast attacks, and territorial disputes. Small armies moved along roads, through valleys, and across hills, trying to surprise the enemy at their most vulnerable moment. On the Syrian side, command was in the hands of King Ben-Hadad. He led one of the most feared armies in the region. His war chariots were pulled by trained horses, built to advance at speed and crush enemy formations. Syrian archers were known for deadly precision. The infantry had already conquered entire cities. Militarily, the advantage was clear. The Syrian king's plan was simple and effective: set ambushes at strategic points and catch the king of Israel off guard. Choose narrow valleys, important crossroads, mountain passes, places where an army would have no room to maneuver. It was a common strategy in the ancient world, and it usually worked. But this time, something strange began to happen. Every time the Syrian king positioned his troops in a certain place, the Israelites simply did not appear. He chose a valley for an ambush. The army of Israel took another route. He set a trap on a road. The Israelites passed by a different path. Once could be coincidence, twice luck, but it kept happening. The biblical text says, "This happened many times, not once, not twice." It was as if the enemy knew every plan before it was even executed. For a military commander, there is no more dangerous situation than that. Because if the enemy knows your strategy, you have already lost the war before the battle begins. The Syrian king's frustration began to turn into suspicion, and suspicion quickly became paranoia. He gathered his closest officers, generals, war counselors, men who took part in the most secret decisions of the kingdom. And in that room, he made a direct accusation. Someone there was a traitor. Someone was passing information to the king of Israel. It was an extremely serious accusation. In those days, espionage was punished with immediate death. No trial, no second chance. The officers looked at one another. Silence filled the room, until one of them decided to speak. There was no traitor. The problem was not military, it was spiritual. The officer explained that in Israel there was a prophet named Elisha, and this prophet had an ability that defied all logic of war. He could hear the words the Syrian king spoke. Inside his own bedroom, there were no spies, no hidden scouts, no human strategy. The prophet simply knew, and he told everything to the king of Israel. Suddenly, everything made sense. Every failed ambush, every plan that collapsed, every useless maneuver. The Syrian king was not fighting only against an army. He was fighting against someone who knew his secrets before he even left the palace. And that was something swords, horses, and war chariots could not solve. The king's decision was immediate. If the problem was one man, then eliminate the man. For the king of Syria, the war had changed in nature. Until that moment, the problem was the army of Israel. Now, everything pointed to a single name, Elisha. He was not a general. He commanded no troops. He carried no weapons. He lived in no palaces. He was only a prophet. But in practice, that solitary man was canceling out the entire Syrian military strategy. The king did not hesitate. If the plans were being revealed, then the solution was simple: capture the prophet. He ordered them to find out where Elisha was. Spies were sent. Informants were questioned. Messengers crossed the roads of the region. The answer came quickly. Elisha was in Dothan. Dothan was not a fortified city. It had no imposing walls. It had no significant military garrison. It was a small town set among hills, about 19 kilometers north of Samaria. An easy target, but the Syrian king did not want to take risks. If that prophet truly knew what was spoken in closed rooms, then any mistake could mean the failure of the mission. So he did not send a small detachment. He sent horses, war chariots, and a heavy military force. The biblical text describes the dispatch of a great army, a disproportionate mobilization to capture a single man. But for the Syrian king, it made sense. If Elisha remained free, no military strategy would work. That night, the troops marched in silence. Night movements were common in the ancient world. Avoid the heat of the day, preserve the strength of the horses, and above all, reach the target before any warning could spread. The Syrian soldiers crossed dark valleys, climbed the hills around Dothan, and positioned themselves around the city while everyone still slept. Cavalry at the exits, war chariots on the main routes, infantry closing every access. When the first light of dawn touched the hills, the siege was already complete. No escape, no messenger, no chance of flight. Somewhere inside that small town, an elderly prophet was still asleep, unaware that the greatest army in the region had marched through the night, just to capture him. And it was his servant who saw it first. When the door opened that morning, the sight outside looked like something from a nightmare. The servant opened the door at dawn, like on any other day, perhaps to fetch water, perhaps to check the weather, perhaps simply to begin the routine before the sun rose completely. But when his eyes adjusted to the dim light of dawn, what he saw did not seem real. Horses everywhere, the shine of weapons reflecting the first light of day, soldiers positioned in siege formation. The hills around Dothan were covered. War chariots blocked the exit routes. Archers occupied the high ground. Infantry closed every access to the city. The servant could see Syrian banners waving in the wind. Shields aligned, spears raised, formations ready to advance. That army was not there to negotiate. It was there to capture or kill. The panic was immediate. The servant stepped back, almost stumbling as he entered the house. His heart racing, his breath short, his mind searching for a way out where none existed. He ran to Elisha and woke him with a sentence that carried all the desperation of that moment. "My Lord, what shall we do?" It was not just a question. It was a cry of helplessness. The math was brutal. An entire army against 2 unarmed men inside a house of clay. There were no walls. There were no allied soldiers. There was no escape route. Everything pointed to the end. But Elisha's reaction did not follow any human logic. He did not rise in fear. He did not run to the windows. He did not start making escape plans. His voice came out calm, steady, as if nothing had changed. "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." The servant must have looked around, confused. Inside the house, he saw only 2 men. Outside, hundreds, perhaps thousands of armed soldiers. The numbers did not add up. Either Elisha had lost his mind, or he knew something human eyes could not see. Then the prophet prayed. But it was not a prayer for deliverance. It was not a cry for protection. It was not a request for God to destroy the enemy army. The request was simple, direct, and completely unexpected. "Lord, I ask you to open this young man's eyes so that he may see." The servant was still trying to understand Elisha's words when something changed before his eyes. There was no thunder, no earthquake, no sound of battle. The only thing that changed was his vision. It was as if a veil had been lifted. Suddenly, the hills around Dothan were no longer empty. The entire mountain was covered. Horses of fire, chariots of fire, a celestial army positioned between the city and the Syrian troops. The servant blinked, trying to understand what he was seeing. When the servant's eyes were opened, the landscape of Dothan was no longer just hills of stone and dry earth. The entire mountain seemed alive. Where before there had only been rocks and shadows, now there were rows of fiery horses, positioned like a cavalry ready to advance. The celestial chariots were not like the Syrian war chariots. There were no wooden wheels, no iron, no stretched leather. They seemed made of pure flame, luminous structures, pulsing like living embers, as if fire itself had taken the shape of a vehicle. And they were not moving in chaos. They were organized, aligned, positioned, in battle formation. The servant noticed something even more astonishing. The celestial army was not inside the city. It was not around Elisha's house. It was between Dothan and the Syrian army, like a living wall. As if each hill had been taken by a force that had been invisible until then. As if the spiritual world had always been there, only hidden behind a veil. The servant probably took a deep breath, trying to understand what he was seeing. On one side, soldiers of flesh and bone, wearing heavy armor, sharp spears, horses tired from the night march. On the other side, beings that seemed made of fire and light, immune to fatigue, immune to fear, immune to human limitations. In that moment, the human threat lost its size. The Syrian army had not changed in number. The war chariots were still there. The spears were still pointed at the city. But the reality was different, because now the servant knew something that no Syrian soldier could imagine. They were not surrounding the prophet. They were surrounded by an army that did not belong to this world. And perhaps for the first time that morning, the fear began to fade. Not because the danger had disappeared, but because the truth was greater than the danger. On one side, soldiers of flesh and bone, bronze armor, sharp swords, panting horses, war chariots ready to advance. On the other side, beings of fire, horses that shone like living embers, chariots that seemed made of moving flames, a force that did not obey the laws of the physical world. The entire mountain was filled. It was not a small group. It was not a celestial escort. It was a complete host, positioned like an army in battle formation. The math changed in that instant. It was no longer one army against two men. It was one army against another army. And the army of fire surrounded the army of flesh. Elisha showed no surprise. For him, this was not a revelation. It was only the confirmation of something he already knew. While the servant saw only danger, the prophet had always seen the protection. While the servant counted soldiers, Elisha knew the invisible army. But the most surprising part was still to come. The celestial army did not move. The horses of fire did not advance. The supernatural chariots did not attack. The power was there, but it was not used. And instead of ordering an attack, Elisha made another prayer. While the servant still watched the army of fire on the hills, the Syrian soldiers began to descend toward the city. For them, nothing had changed. Dothan was still defenseless. The target was still inside the city. The mission was simple: capture the prophet. When the troops approached, Elisha went out to meet them, not with a sword, not with an army, only with a prayer. Lord, strike these people with blindness. And in that instant, the entire army lost its sight. It was not ordinary darkness. It was not just the absence of light. It was total confusion. Trained soldiers could not distinguish the paths. Commanders did not know where their troops were. Horses became restless, disoriented. Perfect military formations turned into chaos. The most feared war machine in the region became completely vulnerable, without a single sword being raised. Then, something even more surprising happened. Elisha walked into the middle of the blind army. The same man they had come to capture was now standing before them, guiding their steps. And he said, "This is not the road, nor is this the city. Follow me, and I will lead you to the man you seek." It was true. They were looking for the prophet of Israel, and the prophet was right there. But the blind soldiers did not know it, and they trusted the voice that was guiding them. The Syrian soldiers had no choice. Without sight, without orientation, without knowing where they were, the only thing they could do was follow the voice of the man who spoke with authority. And so, the march began. It was no longer an army in battle formation. There was no perfect discipline, no alignment of shields. It was a disorganized column of blind men, horses being pulled by the reins, commanders trying to maintain order without seeing the road. They descended the hills of Dothan slowly. They crossed narrow valleys. They passed through dirt paths, where they would normally march with speed and confidence. But now, every step was uncertain. Every stone in the path was an obstacle. Every turn in the terrain was a risk. The army that had marched proudly through the night now walked in silence, completely dependent on the voice of the man they had been sent to capture. And none of them realized that with every step, they were being led to the heart of enemy territory. Elisha then guided the entire Syrian army for about 19 kilometers from small Dothan to Samaria, the capital of the kingdom of Israel. An elderly prophet leading thousands of enemy soldiers, blind and vulnerable, crossing valleys and hills into the heart of hostile territory. The hunters being led by the hunted. When they arrived in Samaria, Elisha made another prayer. Lord, open the eyes of these men so they may see. Their sight returned. The soldiers blinked, adjusting to the light, and realized where they were. Not in Dothan, not surrounding a defenseless city. They were inside Samaria, in the middle of the capital of Israel, now surrounded by the army of the king of Israel. The trap had been turned upside down. The besiegers were now besieged. The king of Israel saw the opportunity and asked Elisha, "Shall I strike them down? Shall I strike them down, my father?" The repetition showed his anxiety. It was the chance to eliminate a large part of the enemy army at once. An easy victory. Revenge for years of war. But Elisha's answer was immediate. "You shall not strike them down." The command was different. Set bread and water before them, so they may eat, drink, and return to their master. Instead of execution, a banquet, the king of Israel prepared a great meal for the Syrian soldiers. Abundant food, water to quench their thirst, hospitality instead of swords. And then he sent them back, an entire army returning to Syria, with a story impossible to explain. They had been blinded, led into the enemy stronghold, and instead of death, they received dinner. The biblical text records the result. From that day on, Syrian raiding bands no longer invaded the land of Israel. The war did not end with a battle. It ended with a miracle and a table prepared for enemies. That morning in Dothan, the servant of Elisha saw something most people never see. The entire mountain covered with horses and chariots of fire. A celestial army in battle position. But there is an important detail in this story. The army of fire did not attack. The celestial horses did not advance. The supernatural chariots did not crush the Syrian troops. No invisible sword fell from heaven. The power was there, real, present, ready. But it was not used. The victory did not come through destruction. It came through blindness, through guidance, through a banquet. This challenges human logic. If you have a celestial army at your disposal, the natural reaction would be to use it. Destroy the enemy, demonstrate strength, make sure no one dares to attack again. But in Dothan, God chose another path, to show power without using it, to win without killing, to turn enemies into witnesses instead of corpses. And this was not the only time the invisible army was present. Without intervening, centuries later, on another night surrounded by soldiers, another man became the target of a siege. Not in Dothan, but in the Garden of Gethsemane. The soldiers arrived with swords, torches, and chains. One of the disciples reacted as any man would. He drew his sword. But Jesus' response was immediate. "Put your sword away." And then he said something that echoes directly the story of Elisha. "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? 12 legions, more than 70,000 heavenly beings, ready to intervene with a single word. The same invisible army of Dothan was available that night. But unlike Elisha, Jesus did not activate that force. In Dothan, the army of fire protected the prophet. In Gethsemane, the army of fire remained silent. The same God, the same power. Two different decisions, because sometimes divine protection delivers you from the valley, and sometimes it walks with you through it. Elisha's servant learned that he was never alone, even when human eyes saw only danger. And since that morning in Dothan, that truth has echoed through the centuries. There is an invisible army around those whom God calls. Even when no one can see it, even when the siege seems complete, even when the math says there is no way out, because, in many battles, the numbers never tell the whole story. That morning in Dothan, no sword was raised, no blood was spilled. No wall fell, and yet an entire army went home defeated. Not by human strength, but by something that could not be seen. Because sometimes the decisive battle happens in the invisible world.